It's early February, winter here in England, and our gardens are quiet as the plants wait for spring. With the Botany Bay project, this time of waiting offers us the space to think about some of the heritage we'll be drawing from as we plant our new gardens, looking into the migration stories of our plants and food, and considering how these reflect some of the big issues we face in the world today. Plant migration is linked to colonialism, and colonialism is linked to climate change. We can see here how some of the plants are starting to flower a month earlier than they used to, as a result of this exceptionally mild winter. It's just one indication of the imbalances we need to put right. I'm Beth Kidd, and I'm a volunteer on the Botany Bay project. I'm also a researcher at University College London in the history of science, and I'm currently investigating botanical collecting in the 17th and 18th centuries. I've come to Oxford to explore the university's collection of winter gardens.
A winter garden is, or hortus hymenalis, is literally a herbarium. So a herbarium is a collection of flattened, dried plants. And it also gives the other name for a plant, such a collection as a hortus siccus, a dry garden. So what we've got here is the herbarium of Jacob Bobart the Elder. So Jacob Bobart the Elder was the first keeper of the Botanic Gardens in Oxford. He was an ex-German soldier, and he was a publican in Oxford. When he started planting the garden in 1642, he seems to have also started to collect herbarium specimens. And a herbarium specimen is a flattened, dried specimen which is then mounted and preserved. And usually with those sorts of specimens, you get information about, well, obviously what the plant is, you get information about when it was collected, and also information about where it was collected. And so the book herbarium sort of develops into this system where you can actually move specimens around in your collection. So in a book, specimens are fixed in particular positions, whereas if they're kept as loose leaves, then you can move them around in your collection, particularly if you're interested in trying to arrange the world, if you're trying to create a classification system and bring order to all of this apparent chaos that is in the natural world. We've got these two plants here, which we now know as Tradescantia. Tradescantia is a name that was given by Linnaeus in the middle of the 18th century to commemorate the John Tradescants. And but in this period, this plant was being called Phalangium virginianum, and we've got two different colour forms. We've got a blue form here, Flor Carulio, and we've got the white form here, which is Flor albo. And then below that, we've got a common name. We've got the blue Virginia spiderwort, and we've got the white Virginia spiderwort.
The two gardeners, called John Tradescant, the elder and younger, are buried in this magnificent tomb in what is now the Garden Museum, close to their Lambeth home, which was appropriately known as the Ark. The Tradescants were great collectors, particularly John the Younger, who collected both plants and cultural objects during several voyages to America. The Ark, with its cabinet of curiosities, became like a museum, open to an English public that was fascinated by this new world. Winter gardens and museums seem to have a great deal in common. Both represent and attempt to control the world, gathering and categorizing objects from many lands that had or would come under British rule. Today, Indigenous people are raising important questions about the colonial roots of such collections. Rosalyn LaPier is an ethnobotanist, educated in both the Western academic system and the Indigenous system of the Blackfeet tribe of Montana, of which she is an enrolled member.
This is the 1802 Arrowsmith map, which was used by Lewis and Clark as part of the Corps of Discovery. And you can sort of see the map is kind of well defined on the eastern seaboard, but then when you get into the middle of North America and to the west, it's sort of this blank tablet. It wasn't a blank tablet to the indigenous people who lived there, but it was a blank tablet to the Americans. But one of the things that this does, today in the 21st century, is this really does represent still kind of this erasure of indigenous peoples off the land and landscape. And, after sort of this erasure occurs, one of the things that colonial governments did during the 19th century was sort of stake their claim, right, to what they believed as sort of this empty landscape. And one of the arguments that I assert is that the act of sort of staking claim to indigenous lands, also came with this act of staking claim to natural history and the natural history that existed on those lands. And so one way that the Americans did this was through the collection of indigenous knowledge and indigenous objects.
So Mark Catesby was a collector. He was sent to this part of the world by an English botanist called William Sherard, and he was sent to collect living plants and herbarium specimens. When he came back, he brought back a lot of herbarium material and sketches, and from those sketches, from that information, he constructed this book, which is the natural history of Carolina, Florida, and the Bahama Islands.
Was Catesby interested in indigenous knowledge of botany? Did he learn anything that we can read about now from the indigenous population?
Yes, he was interested in this type of thing. So we see in these in these texts where he's drawing on that that knowledge. So for example, when he's talking about the bird, he says the Indians, by way of eminence or admiration, call it. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce that. He uses a common name, and which he translates as meaning 400 tongues.
And so in order to be able to translate that, he must have been in active dialogue with indigenous people.
Yes, and the evidence that we have is that he was doing precisely that. And he does seem to be very sympathetic to the indigenous people, because after all he was relying on them as guides. So we see this name Guajava. Mm-hmm. Guajava is again the Tupi Guarani name for this plant, and Guajava, in fact, is where we get the name guava from.
Plant collectors like Mark Catesby clearly did engage with indigenous people as guides and knowledge keepers. However, as more and more plants and artefacts arrived in European collections into the 19th century, particularly in the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew, colonial power and profit became a central concern. Kew became a distributing ground for plants of economic importance between colonies, such as tobacco and coffee. Here, indigenous knowledge of those plants, that European botanists had long learned from, could be used as a weapon of empire and domination. When John Tredescant the Younger died in 1662, his cabinet of curiosities passed to a highly ambitious man called Elias Ashmole, who is also buried in what is now the Garden Museum. It was an acrimonious inheritance. One story goes that John's widow, Hester, disputed his inheritance of her husband's collection, burning the deed of the gift and claiming in court that Ashmole had cajoled John into signing while he was drunk and grief-stricken at the death of their young son. The courts, however, ruled in favour of Ashmole, who brought the collection here to Oxford, where it formed the basis of the Ashmolean Museum, originally a building in Broad Street, which moved to the present Beaumont Street site in 1894. In the Ark were objects collected by the younger Tradescant on his visit to Virginia in 1637. It also contained the mantle of Powhatan, named for the great chief Wahun Seneca, the father of Pocahontas. How precisely it came to the Ark is unknown. It may have travelled with Pocahontas herself, who famously visited London in 1616 with her husband John Rolfe. It's probably no coincidence Rolfe was the first Englishman successfully to cultivate tobacco in America. His marriage was likely a deliberate means of allying with the Powhatan tribe, who possessed specialist knowledge of curing tobacco. Tobacco made Rolfe's fortune.
Our first interaction that we had with the United States government was through a military and scientific expedition that was led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, called the Corps of Discovery. So Lewis and Clark, just as a reminder, illegally trespassed across Blackfoot lands, collecting specimens of plants, animals, ethnography, and other types of natural history. And they did this, again, as a reminder, with the servitude of enslaved peoples. So this American scientific methodology, set forth under really the strict instructions by President Thomas Jefferson, would continue throughout the 19th century. And the United States government, private museums, and even individuals began collecting within Indigenous communities, again, without consent.
This is the Swedish botanist, Carl Linnaeus, painted around the time of his visit to London in 1736. Linnaeus had recently visited the lands of the indigenous Sami people in the Arctic, and came to England wearing the traditional Sami costume we see here. However, his approach to indigenous knowledge was either to appropriate it or to suppress it.
He introduced a naming system for plants that was based on the concept of what was called the binomial. So a scientific name should have two elements. It has the first of the names is the generic name, and then we've got the species epithet. The Mayan name for chocolate, from which we get the name chocolate from, he considered that offensive. So he changed the entire name to Theobroma into Latin. It means the same thing, but he did not like the Mayan name, so he transliterated it into Latin.
So he's justifying that as being because they're difficult to pronounce.
Yes. Many people are aware of the way that he divided humans up into different groups. Now, that may not have been such a problem in terms of dividing things up, but he goes the step further and he associates those groups with character traits and with emotional traits and with his perceptions of what these people are like, and that becomes embedded within his classification system. And so really that classification system, it loses objectivity. It's no longer based on things that you can actually really observe.
Linnaeus classified not only plants, but people. He ranked 4 and later 6 varieties of human, associating skin colour with certain innate behaviours, and placing Homo africanus on the bottom rung. Africanus was deemed to be of black complexion, phlegmatic temperament, crafty, indolent, governed in their actions by caprice. On the other hand, Homo europaeus was of fair complexion, sanguine temperament and becoming form, of gentle manners, acute in judgment, governed by fixed laws. The science of botany is deeply entwined with the history of systemic racism. Racism still embedded in many scientific names we give plants today.
So I argue that their acquisition of both tangible and intangible objects for natural history collections over the course of more than a century, actually leading into 2 centuries, amounts to a slow violence. And again, let's kind of reflect on the definition of slow violence, is that it occurs gradually and out of sight. It is a violence of delayed destruction that is dispersed across time and space. That is typically not viewed as violence at all.